Now I'm going to talk about the 7 milestones of anti-Zionism, and I'll prove that anti-Zionism existed long before Zionism, which was the political reality of Israel, the existence of an actual country rather than an idea and a concept of a homeland. In 2001 was the UN Durban Conference Against Racism, and this had been heavily influenced by the build-up conference in Tehran, where Jews and Israelis were not invited until after the conference had finished. The subsequent Durban UN conference, which was based around that, was described by the American delegate and Holocaust survivor, Tom Lantos, as the most sickening display of anti-Semitism he had experienced since the Holocaust. You can imagine how bad that was. Jewish delegates were intimidated, harassed, and abused. Anti-Semitic literature, including the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, was available at conference stands. Anti-Semitic leaflets were given out. Swastikas were taped to the wall. And a 20,000 person crowd unveiled a Hitler was right banner. It was here in 2001, in an anti-racism conference by the UN, that calling Israel an apartheid state and accusing it of the sole source of wrongdoing at the expense of all other causes became the cause of the day. Amnesty and other NGOs signed a declaration calling Israel a racist apartheid state guilty of genocide. So what Durban did is it restarted the Soviet anti-Semitic campaign from 1975, which was passed by the UN, Zionism is racism, and it was rescinded, but it came back in this new guise. And so we see this quote: the Torah, which is the Jewish scriptures, is an unsurpassed textbook of bloodthirstiness, hypocrisy, treachery, and so on and so forth. Now, I'm a bit tired, so you guys are going to help me at this point. It's quiz time. So liven up. I'm going to have a show of hands, please. Who thinks this is a left-wing quote? Who thinks this is a quote from a left-winger? Can I have a show of hands, please? Does anyone think this is a quote from a right-winger? Can we have a show of hands? And anyone think this is religious hate? Well, yes, you're correct. Of course, it is religious hate, but it's actually from the left. It's a Soviet piece of writing called The Encroaching Counter-Revolution from 1974. This is our second milestone, and it's Soviet anti-Semitism. And the anti-Semitism of much of the left derives from Soviet anti-Semitism. This reached another level after 1967, when the Soviets realized that Israel was not going to become another communist outpost and turn their faces strongly against it. And what they said was that Israel was Nazi, illegitimate, and imperialist. Now, obviously, Putin was a lieutenant in the KGB. So when Ukraine happened, he also called them Nazi, illegitimate, and imperialist, because you can just reuse these things. Maybe they don't have quite the same impact. Such was its power that anti-Semitism was central to Soviet propaganda. The KGB, as Isabella Tabarovsky, a historian, says, had many known Hitler admirers. So their Nazi propaganda, they needed plausible deniability. They needed space after the war. So they called it anti-Zionism. So whereas the Nazis opposed Chagall as an assault on Western civilization, the Soviets opposed Chagall's art as being opposed to Zionism. It even got a scientific sounding name, Zionology, because everyone knows you put an ology on the end of something, it sounds real, right? And the material became mandatory reading in the Soviet Union. Books, brochures, articles were published in many languages, and many linked to Caution Zionism, which was written by the Central Committee. Yuri Ivanov was the deputy of military intelligence, and his colleagues called him the main Yidologist of the Soviet Union. So today, we see the same idea as Zionology manifested, and there is an institute for the critical study of Zionism. Now, their very first conference showed their irrational norms, with attendees having to pass a Soviet-style purity test and pledge allegiance to anti-Zionism. No dissent allowed. What kind of academia is that? Bad academia. And how did this end in the Soviet Union? How did this roll out? Well, Jews were targeted for an ongoing campaign of exclusion and execution, even if they were ideologically pure. For example, Slansky was general secretary who ran communism in Czechoslovakia. He and 10 other Jewish leaders were executed, accused of Zionism, and suffered show trials. So socialist purity and anti-Zionist purity offered them no protection, and the same went for the leaders of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. They didn't even bother giving them show trials, so ridiculous was the idea. And so forced assimilation and demonization was the Soviet answer to the Jewish question. And we see these same campaigns played out on campus today. Organizations like SJP borrow this for their social media campaigns to shame and exclude Jews who are Zionists. Of course, whatever your intention, if you're going to ban Zionist groups, which happened in Britain during the 1980s, the effect is anti-Semitic. You're banning Jewish groups. Now I'm going to give you another quote. The Zionists try to make the rest of the world believe that the national consciousness of the Jews finds its satisfaction in the creation of a Palestinian state. Can we have a show of hands for people who think this is from a left-wing politician, please? And can we have a show of hands who thinks this is from a right-wing politician? Okay, so not one single person thought it was a right-wing politician, but the answer is it was Adolf Hitler, and it was written in Mein Kampf. It's an easy mistake to make because the Nazis also rallied against the idea of a Jewish state, and they also said it was illegitimate and imperialist. And this brings us on to our next milestone, our third milestone. This looks like a kind of maybe a US neo-Nazi or white supremacist flag to me, but it's not. It's the Syrian Social Nationalist Party flag, still the second biggest party in Syria, and it was a fascist-style party founded in the 30s. And the same went for many other parties, like the Ba'ath Party, which rules Syria to this day, and the still influential Muslim Brotherhood, founded by al-Banna. He translated Nazi propaganda such as Der Stürmer and Mein Kampf, which he retitled My Jihad. Now, the Nazis directly funded this group and their anti-Jewish violence, and the Brotherhood used the slogan, Jews out of Egypt and Palestine. And to give you an idea, Hamas eventually became their armed wing in Palestine. So, to give you an overview, Arab nationalism peaked in the 1920s. And as you can see from this newspaper clipping from 1934, boycotts against Jews living in the region of Jerusalem and the surrounding region did not need Israel. BDS was already a thing. The Grand Mufti started planning violence against Jews as early as 1919. It was he who began the rumor that the Jews were planning to storm Al-Aqsa as a pretext to eliminate the ancient Jewish community of Hebron in 1929, which you can see from that news clipping as well. And this incitement to anti-Jewish violence still continues to this day. We see it posted on Twitter and on social media. Now, the Mufti had his own SS division and planned the Holocaust of Jews directly in the region with Hitler. But the underreported part of this story is the levels of Nazi propaganda that went on. And it was a little bit different to European anti-Semitism because Jews had inferior status in the Middle East, a bit like medieval Europe had. They had a precarious situation, but there was no secular revolution. There was no equal rights or any of this. So the idea of Jewish power just didn't resonate the same in the Middle East like it did with Europe. So the Nazis ran a massive campaign to link Jews as a threat to the Quran, as a threat to Islam, and created a radical new interpretation of the Quran, and with it, radical anti-Zionism. A good example of that is the book Islam and Judaism in 1937, which they produced. But the really key part here is their radio broadcasts, where they use trusted figures such as the Mufti, because it was the new tech of the day and literacy rates were not high. And this is a way to get the message out across cafes and marketplaces, etc., etc. And to give you an idea of its importance, the Nazi department for this radio broadcast alone was 255 people. They also dropped and distributed millions of leaflets across the region, 700,000 at a time in some cases, with messages such as "kill the Jews before they kill you," to smooth the way for the Holocaust, as they had done in Europe. So what happened is it created this really unique blend of European anti-Semitism, Arab nationalism, and this radical new Islamism. I'm going to read you word for word a US intelligence report on Nazi propaganda. And it said that interwoven into every program is the Jewish menace. The Zionist question provides the basic theme. This is the legacy of Nazi propaganda in the Middle East. Unlike Europe, there was no denazification of Arab Nazis and collaborators, and they took senior positions, such as in the Arab Higher Committee. And then post-war, countries like Egypt and Syria hired top Nazis for their war against the Jewish state, such as Eichmann's right-hand man, Alois Brunner, who joined Assad Senior in Syria, and propagandists for Goebbels, Johann von Leers, went to Egypt, and so did top people from the Gestapo, like Leopold Lehm. And the Muslim Brotherhood arranged a huge street rally to push the Arab coalition into rejecting the two-state solution with Israel and silenced opposing voices with threats. So you could argue, as historian Matthias Kunzel does, that the ensuing conflict was a result of the Nazi legacy. And my next milestone is the protocols. The Nazis and the Soviets both drew from the same source material, the Elders of the Protocols of Zion. And it was written in 1903 by the Tsar's secret police. And the reason it was written was because his power was so weakened. And in 1897, we have the first Zionist Congress. And this is the reason why it's one of the milestones, because the protocols pretended to be minutes from the first Zionist Congress. And it's actually recycled dialogue from a French political satire. It was no such thing. There was no private meeting. It was an open meeting. There were non-Jewish journalists there. This was all debunked by the Times newspaper. And what it's about is Jewish power, international Jewish leaders conspiring against the state, making secret plans to infiltrate all aspects of society and to rule the world. And these are the themes that we really see are coming back today in a strong way, and that Jews are responsible for the changes in society. So this was also evident in the anti-Bolshevik White Army expression, "Beat the Jews and save Russia." The idea that the only obstacle to them having their counter-revolution was the Jews. And of course, what happened with the Russian Revolution is that people fleeing took copies of the protocols with them and spread them across the world. Now, the protocols influenced Hitler. He used it for Nazi propaganda with the idea of the puppeteer Jew controlling events. He believed it was him or the Jews. And we can see this published on social media, the same puppeteer idea by Fox News. And we see it in some anti-Zionist literature too. If you want to know the power of the protocols, Well, the Pittsburgh gunman held Jews responsible for white suffering, the Codyville gunman held Jews responsible for Muslim suffering, and the Jersey gunman held Jews responsible for black suffering. QAnon also uses the protocols. Their ideas are spread globally, with the Jewish elite held responsible for hidden nefarious power. Now, these days, we have what I call the Israel protocols, which adds the Jewish state to Jewish power. And it's clear from Soviet propaganda that their protocols simply substitute the word Jew for Zionist, so you get the sinister role of international Zionism instead of international Jewry, which is what the Nazis would have said. There were also common claims that Jewish power was running the Labour Party on behalf of the Jewish state and undermining Britain, a very protocols idea. And for social media, the protocols are commonly represented in a meme by all across the political spectrum. And it usually shows people of influence, like politicians or business leaders, and they have a star next to them, or maybe the Israel flag. And the idea is to show that Jews are infiltrating and controlling the world. BDS Boston created a map linking Jews to corporations and Jewish charities to corporations such as Apple. If in your mind you think of networks of Jewish power, then you will end up with lists and maps of Jews. David Miller was an academic who claimed that making chicken soup was a Zionist plot and that Jewish students were agents of Israel. He was a professor at Bristol University, and he can now be found on Iran state TV. This regular program talks about how all walks of life are controlled by Zionists. Ukraine, music, comedy, football, politics, anything you can think of. Think of it as the protocols for the digital age. They have about 11.5 million viewers on social media. And we also continue to have literature fantasizing about Jewish power. To this day, I would say that anti-Semitism has always been a bestseller. Over 500 years ago, the new tech of the printing press was introduced, and over time it created the roadmap to the Holocaust. Protocols thinking means Jews frequently have been portrayed as parasites and bloodsuckers of humanity, with their control being depicted as tentacles. Now, there's little difference between these portrayals because, again, it draws from the same source material. So the examples are Islamist, left, right, etc., etc. It just goes on and on. And an interesting example is the alien reference, which was posted by someone who was in the Labour Party, but she borrowed it from a far-right website, and underneath stuff like Holocaust denial and use of the N-word, she asked for a higher resolution version of this image. And so you can see that these ideas just mutate, really. So now we get to pre-Zionism era. Decades before the protocols, in 1800s France, Jews gained rights, and leaving the ghetto was shown in anti-Rothschilds cartoons in the newspapers, and the Rothschilds were shown as leading the Jews out of Europe and to Israel. Of course, this was a ridiculous idea. The Rothschilds had fought so hard to become comfortable, had left the ghetto, and the idea that they were going to go to Israel to rebuild was nonsense. But the reason for me talking about this is because it was before Zionism had actually become a political movement. Now, the sixth milestone is blood libel. And you can see here how we see this focus on Israel being a child killer regime. The blood libel was created by a monk called Thomas of Monmouth in medieval Britain, and it said that Jewish scriptures required the blood of non-Jewish children so that the Jews could return to Israel and regain their self-determination and status. So think of it as kind of like a confidence crisis of a society. If you're openly Jewish, chances are, offline or online, you've been called a child killer. Post-Holocaust, as I said, the Jew is replaced by the Jewish state, but the end result is Jews are still being called child killer. Medieval Christendom focused on Jews being antichrist and closely associated with the devil. And it was said to be the ritual reenacting of the murder of Jesus by an international Jewish conspiracy, right? In medieval times, they were still talking about an international Jewish conspiracy. So it just shows you really that the technology of today, we have the internet, and yet it's just being used to carry the village of, well, a village of medieval peasants, really. So the blood libel template was a collaboration between the authorities and the ruling classes for financial benefits. It started in 1144, and the idea eventually spread across Europe, turning people into homicidal maniacs. And 100 years later, the King of England intervened in one case, and that is the reason why it became used in ballads and literature, such as the Canterbury Tales. And the success of this, of the blood libel, and of anti-Semitism in general, is how it recreates itself. So the same collective memory resurfaced with the Nazis. Especially in 1934, they devoted a whole issue of Der Stürmer to it. And in 2005, a parliament had 20 members sign and submit a petition to ban all Jewish groups on the grounds of blood libel. And it was called the Letter of the 5,000. And the parliament was the Russian Duma. Although classic blood libel is less common in its original form, the ancient themes of bloodthirsty Jews and children lives on because it still causes a thrill. It's more common in its classic form across the Middle East, particularly by Islamist groups. So, for example, in 2003, Ash-Shatar was broadcast across the region in Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Jordan, and it depicted Jews murdering Christian children and draining their blood to make bread. And QAnon, as has been well publicized, the alt-right fixated on Jewish figures such as the Rothschilds as being responsible for the murder of children. People want to believe these lies about Jews like they want to believe in the tooth fairy. So you get this again across the board, a cartoon by the oldest Italian daily, a liberal newspaper, portraying Jesus as a baby being attacked by a tank with the Star of David on, saying, surely they don't want to kill me again. Ritual murder. It can be seen posted by the ex-former director of Al Jazeera. After 2,000 years, it's the same killer, we're told. And again, on a placard in an anti-Israel march, which says, do not let them do the same thing again. The New York Times ran an unprecedented front page about the Jewish state being child killers, and who couldn't fail to be moved by those images. It transpired that some were Israelis, some were killed by Hamas. A stock library image was used, and Facebook accounts revealed that some were militants posing with weapons and flags. So basic journalistic standards had failed, and they provided a distorted, sensationalized story with a terrible ancient resonance. In the past, they did it to get pilgrims to a cathedral, but now they're doing it for clicks. And my 7th milestone is Augustine. Bishop Augustine was the most important church father, and without him, Judaism may not have survived past the 5th century. He said that not all Jews should be murdered, but to keep them around because their loss of land and loss of self-determination and loss of status showed that Christianity was the superior replacement. And so Judaism survived, but the theological basis for anti-Zionism was created, along with a kind of superiority complex which manifests when Jews are seen to be successful.